everyone, and welcome to the January episode of Wildlife Wednesday Monthly Roundup. I'm your host, Tenley Thompson, and we've got some great videos to show you from all over the greater Yellowstone ecosystem this month. Let's go ahead and get started with a look at winter and river otter adaptations with Tyler.
While giving a recent tour in Grand Teton National Park, my guests and I came across a coalition of male otters. After observing them for a while, a large male brought this lake trout to the shore to feast on. Fish make up the majority of the river otter's diet. They need a regular supply of rich meat like fish in order to stay warm in the cold waters they call home. While otters prefer fish, they will opportunistically hunt aquatic birds and rodents as well. They are one of the few animals known to enter beaver lodges and prey on beaver kits. Otters hunt primarily by diving and using their vibrissae or whiskers to detect moving prey underwater. They typically catch and dispatch their prey using their teeth. Because of their need for rich fishing grounds, otters become very territorial, and this can lead to conflict between different groups. While on tour, my co-guide Sean witnessed a coalition of males kill a smaller otter. While this behavior is rare in the wild, it does serve a purpose, as otters with better defended territories survive better in the winter. My name is Tyler Greenlee, and I'll see you next time on Wildlife Wednesday.
Thanks, Tyler. Some pretty crazy stuff going on in the river otter world. Next, I thought it'd be really fun to get a good look at where do the elk in Jackson Hole come from and what is the history of the National Elk Refuge. So let's take a look at some great photos furnished by the Jackson Hole Historical Society to find out a little bit more on that topic.
For thousands of years, elk herds migrated from what is now Yellowstone and Grand Teton through Jackson Hole on their way to winter ranges in southern Wyoming. As the first homesteads grew in the late 1890s in Jackson Hole, those homesteaders farmed hay on the same land elk had traditionally used on their way south. Elk migration routes were increasingly disrupted by settlers' wire fences, and elk gradually ceased to migrate beyond Jackson Hole. On top of all this, wearing elk jewelry became a fashion item starting in the 1890s. An elk tooth on a watch chain was considered a status symbol. This created a large demand, and elk ivories could cost as much as $100 a pair. One of the molars on the elk is actually made of ivory, a little-known fact that is embodied by their scientific name, Cervus elephas, or in English, the elephant deer. The American elk ivory was a hot commodity, and hunters flooded into northwest Wyoming. They were called tuskers by the locals. Tuskers were poachers and killed elk by the thousands. And it was said that tuskers killed more elk in a single winter than were killed in 10 years of normal hunting. In 1888, there were over 50,000 elk in Jackson Hole. By 1890, migration routes south were all but lost from settlement. Then came the tuskers and the hunting. But the final blow was 4 harsh winters, one in 1889, which killed over 20,000 elk, and then 3 hard winters between 1909 and 1911. Elk were never meant to winter in such difficult conditions as Jackson Hole, but they had nowhere to go. The winter of 1909 was particularly devastating. The winter had begun with heavy snow that drove more than the usual number of elk out of the high country. Wet snow turned to rain, which then froze, making it nearly impossible for the elk to reach food. The elk invaded ranches, haystacks, and the town of Jackson. Desperate. One resident noted in the spring of 1909 that it was possible to walk at least 2 miles stepping on elk carcasses without ever putting foot on the ground. By 1912, there were less than 10,000 elk left in Jackson Hole. Enter Stephen Leake, a local legend and a man of mixed history. Leake homesteaded in Jackson Hole early on and cared deeply for its elk. While modern accounts largely ignore Leake's mixed past, it's important to note that he particularly blamed the Bannock and Shoshone people who had hunted in the valley for centuries, as well as black buffalo soldiers for overhunting and tusking in Jackson Hole. This was completely untrue. Leake even joined a posse that massacred several Native people in the Bannock War of 1895, which caused them to lose their treaty hunting rights. Despite this, Stephen Leake is largely responsible for publicizing the plight of the elk and is responsible for the foundation of the modern conservation effort to save them. Leake documented the deaths of elk in Jackson Hole and garnered national attention for the problem. His photos were published around the country, and he was known as the father of the elk. The public demanded Congress do something, and Congress responded by giving money to feed the elk and investigate the problem. Then, in 1912, Congress appropriated $50,000 to purchase 1,760 acres north of Jackson, and also to set aside an adjacent 1,000 acres of public land. They also purchased additional hay. At this point, elk occupied only 10% of their original winter range. By feeding these elk through the winter, the federal government could ensure that elk didn't go extinct, while also separating them from the haystacks settlers needed to feed their cattle. Eventually, the elk refuge grew to reach 25,000 acres by 1937. The Jackson elk herd remains one of the largest in the country. Elk in this herd were used to reestablish elk herds throughout North America, and Jackson's elk were used to create herds in 37 states, as well as in Canada and Mexico. Since 1909, elk have been supplementally fed all but 10 winters. Under a plan adopted in 2019, elk feeding has been cut in half and eliminated entirely in average winters. Feeding wildlife is now seen as a big problem. It certainly accelerated the decline of migration routes out of Jackson. Soon after the establishment of the refuge, elk that summered in the nearby high country completely ceased winter migrations, and elk started wintering exclusively in Jackson, and they concentrated near the feed grounds. Today, anywhere from 6,000 to 12,000 elk will winter on the National Elk Refuge. Migration is nearly halted. In the 1950s, 25% of the elk population in the elk refuge migrated from Yellowstone. Today, just 2% do. Concentrating elk populations can lead to disease. Chronic wasting disease is an untreatable, easily spread, fatal brain disease that is a big concern and has been detected in Jackson Hole. Brucellosis can spread on a feed ground and be very harmful to the cattle industry. Wyoming Game and Fish Department feels elk populations are too high. Among other issues, overpopulations of elk outcompete mule deer, harm the land, and impact many different species negatively with their abundance. But eliminating feeding could be very harmful to the local cattle industry, as elk would again leave the refuge and quickly eat ranchers' hay that they set aside for cattle. Eliminating feeding could also mean that thousands of elk could die during each of our difficult winters, which likely would not be publicly supported. It is clear, however, that feeding them is doing the population of elk great harm. One thing is clear. The migration routes that elk once used are forever lost. So finding a way to best support wildlife populations and human needs for the landscape continues to be a challenge the elk refuge faces after more than 100 years. And it will always be a challenge in Jackson Hole. In the meantime, seeing the thousands of elk that winter on the open ground north of Jackson will always be a thrill for visitors. And the elk on the elk refuge also protect an entire ecosystem of over 150 bird species and lots of other amazing wildlife. The National Elk Refuge is an early conservation success story that ultimately saved the western Wyoming elk. For Jackson Hole Eco Tour Adventures, this is Tenley Thompson. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about Jackson Hole's National Elk Refuge's history.
So hopefully you guys have learned a little bit more about the National Elk Refuge and the history of the elk of Jackson Hole, which continues to be the largest herd of elk in the United States. Bet you guys didn't know that most of the elk in the United States from new herds actually originally came from Wyoming. So there you go. There's elk in Pennsylvania and, oh gosh, all over the country. Oregon, Washington, all sorts of places that originally came out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. So guys, we did have one last video this evening that was supposed to be about bighorn sheep, and we had some technical difficulties. It's not playing for us. But I do have a great trivia question about bighorn sheep. So what we'll do is we'll play that video for you next month. But in the meantime, I'm going to give you this trivia question. Go ahead and answer in the comment section if you think you know the answer. And one person will be entered to go ahead and win a gift card from our EcoTour Adventures gift store. We started the web store at the beginning of the pandemic as a way to support our guides. 100% of the proceeds from that web store still continue to go towards our guides. So we do have a sponsored item this month, which is our really cool EcoTour Adventures winter hats. So if that looks like that is of interest to you, definitely go check that out on our web store. We'll get the address for that up there in just a moment, but it's jhecotouradventures.com. In the meantime, here's your trivia question of the month. Go ahead and answer in the comment section for your chance to win. It is, what is a common disease found in bighorn sheep populations? A, mycoplasma, B, pneumonia, C, scabies, or D, all of the above? Anybody think they know the answer? This is a little bit of a tricky one. Of course, we did address it a little bit in the video. But what are some ways to prevent disease in bighorn sheep populations? This is your bonus question for an extra entry. Increase genetic diversity, vaccinations, limiting exposure to livestock, A and C, or all of the above. So if you answer the first question, which is supposed to be a little bit easier, that'll go ahead and get you one entry, and then that second question will go ahead and get you a second entry into our gift card giveaway. In the meantime, I'm here to answer your questions live. So if you have a question for somebody with a training as a wildlife biologist or naturalist, or you have questions about the natural world, or Grand Teton, Yellowstone, you're planning on visiting, some of the controversial things that have been happening out here with wildlife lately, chronic wasting disease, I'm here to answer them. It's fun. It's winter. We usually spend about, the first 30 minutes of question and answer talking about Grizzly Bear 399. She is safely hibernating, if anybody is wondering about her. Has not been spotted in about a month, which is really, really good news. For those of you guys who are fond of that grizzly bear, she was out for, almost till like January 10th last winter. So we're really happy to see her safely underneath all of the snow, and hopefully she and the cubs will emerge sometime in late April or early May. But if you've got other questions about the wildlife of the ecosystem, maybe some things you just saw, I'm here to answer them live. I'm going to take a look down at my iPad here. So if you get really confused about why I'm staring downwards, that's what's going on. But in the meantime, let's look. We've got lots of answers to the trivia question. Ooh, lots of good answers to the trivia question. Ooh. We'll see if anybody's got them right. In the meantime, I'm waiting for some questions for me to come in. By the way, all ages questions are appropriate. I'll answer some of the general ones that we've got, generally speaking, in the winter time. So the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, people are always asking me what the heck I mean by that. That is Yellowstone, Grand Teton, and all of the federal lands surrounding those parks. So Yellowstone National Park is America's largest national park, and that's one of the largest national parks in the world. It's about 2 million acres, but the entire area of protected land, National Forest, Bureau of Land Management land, National Elk Refuge National Park surrounding Yellowstone National Park is known collectively as the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And it's the largest area of intact wilderness in the lower 48. It's over 10 million acres. So a lot of people say, oh, I want to go to Yellowstone someday. And what they don't understand is there's a lot more to the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, or the GYE as we call it, than just Yellowstone. There's 10 million acres more, including, of course, Grand Teton and the National Elk Refuge, which are real highlights in the winter. Alton's got a good question for me. He says, why don't all the elk die of wasting disease during winter feeding? Alton, that is a really good question. And the very sort of short version is because we don't have quite enough of it yet. So chronic wasting disease was first detected for the first time in Jackson Hole this last year in 2021. That was the first detected case. But prior to that, we've certainly had some cases really, really close to Jackson Hole in western Wyoming, including a moose 2 years ago that was found in Star Valley, just south of the valley. So our suspicion was that chronic wasting disease was present in the valley. We just didn't have concrete proof. Now we do have concrete proof, but it's still relatively rare. But the problem is when we look at places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Colorado, places where chronic wasting disease is pretty prevalent already, we know that it's not going to be a rare thing very long. So the reason that elk aren't dying of wasting disease during winter feeding right now is we don't have enough of it yet. But the problem is the easiest way for elk to get wasting disease is when elk are concentrating in a small area. They found that populations of elk, particularly in Colorado and Wisconsin, that were, actually, I'm sorry, in this case, deer in Colorado and Wisconsin, same disease, different member of the deer family that has it there, that when deer were less concentrated and spread out a little bit more and more, so to speak, wild, than our population of elk here, that chronic wasting disease was relatively slow to spread. It still spread, but it was relatively slow. Elk on the National Elk Refuge are living on a space that's somewhere in between domesticated and wild. They are wild animals, but they're congregating for that feed. We haven't started feeding for the winter yet on the Elk Refuge. When conditions require it, they're going to go ahead and do it. But remember, they're trying to feed as little as possible these days. Those elk, when they congregate on that feed, are transmitting the disease to each other. And so what's going to happen to our elk herd with chronic wasting disease is a hotly debated subject. There are studies that show that really remote animals are very slow to spread it. And then, of course, chronic wasting disease is abnormally folded protein in the brain. And it's very closely related and perhaps identical to many of these other prion-type disorders. So Creutzfeldt-Jacobs disease in humans is probably very similar, if not the same thing. Mad cow disease is probably very similar, if not the same thing. Scrappy in sheep is probably very similar, if not the same thing. And we know about those diseases that very dense animals, like animals on a feedlot, like cows, spread the disease very, very rapidly. So what's going to happen to the Jackson elk herd? Well, it's going to be something between the very distant and remote animals like we've seen with deer in Wisconsin and, worst case scenario, something more like feedlots like we see with cattle, something in the middle. The best case scenario that has been projected is that elk will live long enough to breed, but probably won't reach very old ages, dying between 2 and 4 years of age if they're continuing to gather in these very small spaces. The scary thing about chronic wasting disease is that it's incredibly difficult to get rid of in the environment once it already exists. There was a Scrappy research station where they were studying the disease, and they went ahead and dug up the soil, I think like 15 feet down, and incinerated it when the project was over to try to eliminate any Scrappy being left in the area. And when they tested the soil again, it was still there. They didn't get rid of it. The problem with a prion-type disorder, prions aren't alive. They're just abnormally folded proteins. And so you can't kill something when it wasn't alive to begin with. So once it's present in the soil, it'll probably be present in the plant material of the National Elk Refuge. And once the damage is done, it's kind of done forever. We're not going to be able to get it out of the environment. So definitely a very concerning disease. There is not necessarily evidence yet that chronic wasting disease could spread to humans. There's suggestions that it could perhaps. There's also studies that show that it would be exceedingly unlikely if it could. You'd have to eat central nervous tissue or brain tissue where these abnormally folded proteins live. And most people aren't eating spinal cord and brain if they're harvesting elk. So the risk to humans is there. They would get Creutzfeldt-Jacobs-like disorder, just like folks who consume things like mad cow, but exceedingly unlikely. So there's probably not a lot of reason to panic over that. After all, when we look at situations like Colorado and Wisconsin, we haven't seen a lot of those disorders taking place. So hopefully that gives you guys a little bit more about chronic wasting disease than you really wanted to know. But scary stuff, scary stuff. Definitely something to be concerned about as we look to the future of the National Elk Refuge. Let's see. Adam asks, lots of wolves killed. Adam, I'm assuming you're talking about the wolf hunt in Montana on Yellowstone National Park. So for those of you guys, once again, out of the loop of Western controversy in wildlife, in Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, wolves were originally expatriated from the western United States, made locally extinct in 1929. They were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park in 1995, and then they were removed from the endangered species list. Actually, they were off again, on again, off again, on again, with a lot of different lawsuits. But they were removed from the endangered species list and have been for several years now, and there have been hunt seasons. Originally, compromises were made between the federal government and the states to allow wolves in particular living near national parks to have lower quotas. Fewer animals were going to be harvested that were being used for the purposes of tourism and for people to enjoy and view. Sadly, 25% of the wolf population of Yellowstone National Park has been shot as it's gone over the state lines in Idaho, Montana in the last 3 months. Wolf populations have definitely been really hard impacted in Yellowstone National Park. We don't know quite yet what that means in terms of viewing opportunities. We do know that wolf populations do recover well from these kinds of hunts, and we do know that wolves can adapt to these changing circumstances. So the wolf populations as a whole will recover. Whether wolves are going to be easy to view in Yellowstone National Park for the next couple of years, we're going to have to wait and see. Sarah Ernst, our guide, is up there right now looking at wolf populations, and Tyler Greenlee, who usually co-hosts this with me, just finished a research project with the Yellowstone Wolf Project, working for the park to monitor those exact same wolf populations. And so he'll probably have a lot more information for you, way more information for you, being a recent researcher of the subject than I do. But I do know that historically when these kinds of things happen, it definitely impacts people's ability to view wolves. And of course, it definitely impacts these wolf populations, killing off the alpha male and female. In some cases, these females, as we get into breeding season, are pregnant females. Seriously going to impact us for a couple years down the road. And more importantly, wolf populations, while they certainly should be monitored and they certainly should be, we should keep an eye on all the wildlife that live in the western states. There is no evidence that wolves become too populous or that they over-reproduce. It's very simple. We've got 100-year period histories in places like Alaska, Alberta, Canada, Isle Royale, Michigan, that show that there's never going to be too many wolves on the landscape. They self-regulate. When wolves become too numerous, guess what the biggest killer of wolves are, guys? Wolves. When they can't find enough food in their territory, they expand into other wolves' territory, which leads to warfare, which leads to a reduction of wolves, which means they don't overhunt any area, and they're not going to kill all the elk, despite some of those silly rumors that you sometimes hear. So there's a little bit of information on that. Speaking of that kind of thing, Lee asks, I noticed this week that the state of Wyoming wants to delist the grizzly bear. What would that realistically mean? Lee, that's a really good question. And that's the question that everybody in the western states wants to know. The Endangered Species Act is supposed to be a temporary removal of animals from state ownership to federal ownership to protect them, bring the species back from the brink of extinction, and then eventually those animals are supposed to go back under state management. So grizzly bears have been on the endangered species list since 1969. They are the longest animal on the endangered species list. The problem we now face is we've run out of wilderness. We have as many grizzlies as we can fit in the wild lands that we have left in the western United States. And so that's not enough grizzlies to be viable genetically, but we don't have anywhere else that they can live. Grizzlies require true wilderness, roadless areas to thrive. And so we could keep them on the endangered species list forever, but that's not the original function of the act. Or we could remove them from the endangered species list without them being a genetically viable population, because we've kind of done the best we can with what we have. There are good arguments on both sides of that debate. There are good reasons to both keep grizzlies on the endangered species list, and there are good reasons to remove grizzlies from the endangered species list, including a case of public trust. You can't necessarily have the public trust that you'll return these animals to state management if, in the case of grizzly bears, you never have. But there's a lot of concern that states, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, where grizzlies live in the continental United States, are not prepared to preserve grizzly bear populations at their current numbers. Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming fundamentally disagreed with the federal government's choice to put grizzly bears on the endangered species list. They felt that grizzly bears were stolen from them, that ownership was removed from them, given to the federal government, that they had no consent over this. And they are determined to prove that the federal government is not going to make decisions for them on how to best manage their wildlife. There's also a lot of support from the hunting constituency for the opportunity to hunt grizzly bears. And so Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming have all made clear that there will be some sort of a hunting quota in place for grizzly bears upon delisting. How many bears will be hunted, where those hunts will take place, how close they will be to national parks and the human habituated bears that live there. That's not all been settled out. But there's no question that there will be some human hunting of grizzly bears in the near future. Are grizzly bears going to be delisted this year? Perhaps. Most likely next year, certainly a possibility. Grizzly bears have been delisted twice now in my adult life, and then lawsuits have put them back on the endangered species list. So yeah, keep an eye open for this. I'm sure it'll make national news when they come off the endangered species list, and then national news if they go back on. But in the meantime, there's an enormous amount of pressure on Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming to try to maintain grizzly bear populations. One of the problems with grizzlies, as my professor in college put them, is that they are breeding failures. They're really bad at reproducing themselves. Any animal at the top of the food chain tends to be a reproductive failure. It's an actual evolutionary adaptation so they don't become too numerous too quickly over time and overeat their environment. Unfortunately, that means that grizzly bears are very, very slow to replace themselves when removed from the ecosystem, either because they've been hit by cars or because they've been hunted by hunters. So definitely a lot of concern there, but we'll definitely see how things go. There's definitely some very valid points of view on all parts of this debate. One of the things about wildlife is there's no such thing as good or bad animals, good or bad grizzlies, and things are controversial not because one side is right and the other side's wrong. It's because the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And people who think that grizzly bears should be under state management definitely have a valid point, and people who feel like grizzly bears may not be managed to the numbers they are today by the states definitely have a valid point. So we'll see how things go in the meantime. Let's see what else we've got here. Oh, Lee Bowen asks, is there a way to reintroduce elk migration to the area? Lee, this is a great idea, and people really would like that to be possible. Reintroducing migration, once it's been lost by any population, has proven to be exceedingly difficult, if not impossible. And we've tried it with a whole bunch of different species. We've tried to use ultralight aircraft to try to show whooping cranes how to migrate from, for instance, Wisconsin down to Florida. For the most part, not terribly successful. We've tried to reintroduce migration, with all sorts of species. And on the whole, it's pretty darn hard to do. Most animals learn how to migrate from their mothers. And if their mothers don't teach them how to migrate, they typically won't migrate. They'll just stay in the place they're put. And it's one of the reasons that allowing populations to become really rare in the first place is such a harmful thing in the long term for the species. Once that migratory pattern is lost, it's very hard to restore. In this particular case, even if we could restore migration routes out of Jackson Hole, the town of Jackson is in the way. They'd have to walk through the entire town of Jackson, a very densely populated area. Imagine 12,000 elk trying to walk through downtown Jackson to migrate out. Certainly not very successful. So that's why it becomes critically important to kind of protect what we have. It's probably the reality situation that the migratory route for elk out of the valley has been lost. So now we're going to have to do the best we can with what we have. And unfortunately, because Jackson Hole was probably never meant to support a large population of wintering elk, that creates the controversy we have today with supplemental feeding and balancing the needs of human use of the land, particularly cattle ranchers, and creating a viable population of elk. How many elk is the right number of elk to have in the valley that won't directly impact things like moose and other animals when they overfeed and therefore cause the other animals to starve to death? We don't actually know that number. In much the same way that when we started looking at recovering beaver populations in the 1940s and 50s, because beavers were so overhunted by fur trappers in the western United States, we didn't actually know what the right number of beavers in the environment was. And even today, that is a subject that can be up to debate. We do know that several different migrations in the greater Yellowstone ecosystems have been lost. So the highway from the town of Jackson to Yellowstone National Park was put in place in 1955 and was the last blow for bighorn sheep migrations out of the Tetons onto probably Black-tailed Butte, because they would have had to go across the highway, and they've never attempted to migrate that route since. So yeah, protecting things like the path of the pronghorn, who migrate in much the same way that elk once did, even perhaps further, then becomes vitally, vitally important. We have to protect these migration corridors, because once they're gone, they're kind of gone forever. So great question. Thanks very much for that. Let's see here. Sadie, you've got a great question. How is the trumpeter swan population doing? Really badly. Really badly. And if you had asked me this 5 years ago, I would have told you that the population is booming and they're doing fantastic. And so your next question, I'm sure, is why are they doing really poorly? We don't know. We have some suspicions, but we don't know. So for those of you guys who don't, monitor trumpeter swan populations for a living and find it fascinating like I do, the very short version of this story is that trumpeter swans were hunted nearly to extinction by feather traders, mostly for the use of ladies' hats. Think, beautiful hats like you'd see in the Kentucky Derby. That was quite the style. And much of the modern American conservation movement actually comes from birders and organizations like the Audubon Society, originally trying to discourage that original trade in all sorts of different kinds of feathers of all sorts of different species that were nearly driven extinct. On top of that, just as trumpeter swan populations started to stabilize, we had the great American agricultural revolution of the 1950s, where modern tractors and agricultural equipment created a great growth in the amount of food and production that we made and farmland that we created in this country. That also meant we drained most of the wetlands in the United States that waterfowl in particular rely on when they migrate. Trumpeter swans, amongst many other waterfowl species, were heavily impacted by that, and their population crashed again. Then the Wyoming Wetlands Society, which is based here in Jackson, Wyoming, worked really, really hard to recover the population. It's hard to say, but less than 60 swans were probably left at the beginning of their project. By the time I was out of college and working in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem as a naturalist, populations in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem were in abundance of 150 individuals. Today, we're down to less than 50. The population has absolutely crashed. And why that's happened is really convoluted and complicated. It's something that's being studied as we speak. But I can give you some of the theories that are out there. None of these have been proven. They've just been postulated. As coyotes have been driven off of things like elk and other carcasses by wolves and the reintroduction of wolves, they've had to go for other prey, and they've started targeting trumpeter swans is one theory. Another theory is that the winter snowpack and changing conditions in the spring and the fall are causing nests to be flooded and the eggs to be killed, and fewer chicks are being born. Another theory is that foxes are suddenly targeting more trumpeter swans. Another theory is that birds of prey, things like bald eagles and the like, are also now, ravens are targeting their eggs. So really hard to say, but trumpeter swans are in trouble. The good news is the Wyoming Wetlands Society continues its essential work of raising and reintroducing swans throughout the western United States. And it's really actually really cool to see. If you ever get a chance to come to Jackson Hole, they actually have captive swans, breeding swan populations that you can see. They're kind of over by our high school, and you can actually see these beautiful rare swans. So swans, of course, were listed as an endangered species until, oh gosh, don't quote me on this, I want to say maybe 2000 is when they were removed from the endangered species list, and they've been off since then. There's been a lot of clamoring to put them back on the list and give them the funding and the protection they need to get those populations up to a viable rate. We do know, of course, that they're one of the largest waterfowl in the United States. I'm sorry, they and white pelicans are the largest waterfowl in the United States, have almost a 7-foot wingspan, if you can imagine that. They're beautiful, beautiful birds. If you ever get an opportunity to see one, the National Elk Refuge has the greatest density of trumpeter swans in the world. So if you come to Jackson Hole, definitely make sure you check them out while you see them. Great question. Thanks very much. Let's see here. Dawn, this is a really good question. Are there grizzly bears in Colorado, or is the state too populated for them to exist? The short answer is probably not in residence. The long answer is there certainly have been grizzlies that have been documented having come down out of the more northern states. We certainly had grizzlies been shot mistakenly, people thinking they were black bears, grizzlies hit by cars. It's certainly happened. But they're probably not finding great viable habitat. One of the things grizzly bears really, really need is roadless habitat, true wilderness without lots and lots of roads. Males can certainly exist in habitat that has roads, but females traditionally prefer true wilderness. And one of the big critical elements of the grizzly bear recovery, gosh, from about 1969 to about 1982, there wasn't really a tremendous growth in their population. Things weren't really going well until they went in and they dug out all the old logging roads in the wilderness and in the forest in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem and kind of revegetated all these old areas that were no longer being used. And then suddenly the cub population really boomed. So we know that that's important. Colorado, of course, very densely populated, lots of farmland, not as much viable habitat there. There has been discussion of reintroducing grizzly bears to Northern California, which actually does have some viable habitat. What's really fascinating to me about that is that the California grizzly, the one you see on the flag, was probably not a continental United States grizzly like you'd see in Yellowstone or Grand Teton National Park. It is an animal that is now extinct, but was probably a little closer to a Kodiak bear like you'd see in Alaska or British Columbia. There are reports of them feeding on whales in the 1560s off the coast of California, and there's some imagery, although not very much of them, and they are just huge in comparison, size-wise, it appears, than the interior grizzly. Now, I will tell you some good news. In the last election, Colorado did vote to extend protections for gray wolves in the state and to try to recover gray wolves as a population in Colorado. The vote passed by, I want to say it was by 100 votes, an entirely small margin. This referendum, it was really, really close, but they're going to go ahead and try to recover gray wolf species in Colorado. What's been funny about wolves in Colorado is they've definitely been going down into Colorado for a while, and there have even been some rumors of breeding activity going on down there. But the state of Colorado has not really wanted to confirm or acknowledge that this has been going on just because of the controversy that it would cause. So now that there is this referendum in place and they are going to go ahead and restore wolves to Colorado, that's really, really exciting in that we're going to have more expanded range for viable populations of wolves in the West. So pretty cool news. Thanks very much for that. Lee's asking for a little bit more on the grizzly population. What do you mean that a reduction of grizzlies will make it hard to maintain a genetically strong population? Well, grizzly bears, of course, went from a very widespread population. We had grizzlies all across the Great Plains. That's actually where they evolved to be, right? So imagine grizzlies in Nebraska, in Ohio, in all sorts of places you don't think of them today, North and South Dakota, right? The Great Plains. Think of bison thundering across the grasslands and the landscape, and grizzlies hunting those bison. That's where grizzlies are native to. That's what they're known for. They were never particularly well designed to be in mountainous terrain like Yellowstone and Grand Teton. This was just the last habitat that was left that could support their populations with human Europeans' settlement and expansion into the West. So unfortunately, what that means is that grizzly bear populations were perilously low by the 1940s. Grizzlies are really, really hard to count. And one of the big controversies about grizzlies, again and again and again, is how many grizzlies are there? And there are many, many different methods that people use to count grizzlies, including scent stations on trees where grizzlies will kind of rub and their hair will be left and they can do genetic analysis. That's kind of the preferred method right now. It's called Chow 2, all the way to sightings with an idea that a male has a territory of a certain size and a female has a territory of a different size, and then trying to sort of guesstimate based on how much viable habitat is available, how many bears there are. People who like having grizzly bears around tend to underestimate the number of bears because they want to see bears recovered. People who don't like having grizzly bears around tend to overestimate bears because they want to see bears come off the endangered species list. So generally the states will have a higher number than, for instance, the federal government will. The truth, once again, is probably somewhere in the middle. But what is a viable population of grizzlies? How many grizzlies should we have? What's the right number? That's hard to say. We do know that their populations got so low that their genetics became so inbred that what we're now really concerned about is that the populations have been segmented. We have kind of three main populations of grizzlies in the western United States. The greater Yellowstone ecosystem population, Grand Teton and Yellowstone, which are connected. The Grand Teton bears almost certainly came out of Yellowstone originally. Then we have bears in Idaho, particularly the Sawtooth Range and what have you. That population is not connected to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem population. And finally, the population up in the Waterton Lakes Glacier National Park region, which is not connected either to that Idaho population or to that Grand Teton Yellowstone population. And it's because they're in three distinct segmented areas, the concern is they'll continue to inbreed amongst themselves until the animal becomes non-viable. So if an animal becomes inbred enough, it can't reproduce and successfully create young. Really a perilous situation that you don't want to get into. So what the federal government would like to have is more interconnectedness between those populations, migration corridors, if you will, to bring that concept back. We'd have to have a much larger population than we have today to probably have any degree of interconnectedness. After all, that is a huge amount of land between Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, including human use areas, interstates, and all these other things that grizzly bears would have to cross in order to become interconnected. So you could go to an extreme, and this has been discussed, picking up and moving bears from one place to another. So moving glacier bears to Yellowstone, for instance, and trying to diversify their genetics and so that they won't be so inbred. But that's a really, really expensive proposition and not something that the federal government has necessarily had the funding to undertake. Once grizzly bears are delisted, obviously the states are probably certainly not going to want to go ahead and move grizzly bears around like that. That's really, really hard to do for even a small animal. Now imagine an animal who's very large and probably isn't going to take sedation and being put in, cages and moved around very well. It would probably be quite aggressive about those decisions. So really, really hard thing to contemplate. But that's what I mean by genetics and genetic interconnectedness, and having a viable population also means having a genetically viable population. It's not just about numbers, it's about their ability to exist 100, 200 years from now. Hopefully that answers your question. Alton, this is a great question. Could Grand Teton benefit from wildlife bridges, wildlife crossings over the main highway? Well, yeah, very much so. But not nearly as much as some of the other places in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. So that main highway, constructed in 1955 that we're talking about, is obviously a two-lane, very busy road, and animal hits and collisions are incredibly common on that road. It's one of the densest areas for animals to be hit in the United States. But when we get to the south, where mule deer and pronghorn antelope and many of our other species and elk traditionally migrated to, now we're getting into interstate territory with giant semi-trucks and 4 or 5 lanes of traffic. Then it gets really hard to get across. And so the good news is that the state of Wyoming has been working pretty hard on wildlife crossings in some of these particularly at-risk areas. And there's a really awesome organization called Wildlife Tourism for Tomorrow that specifically is focused on wildlife crossings. EcoTour is actually a founding member of that organization. Definitely worth checking out. It's asking the public for its support to build things like wildlife crossings for wildlife across Wyoming. Grand Teton National Park has certainly looked at the issue for wildlife crossings, as has, by the way, Yellowstone. Once again, it's a budget issue. You have to imagine that the National Park Service is under an enormous budget shortfall. Even with that large bill that was passed last year, almost 10 years in the making, to fund the national parks, that's only going to make up 1/3 of the overall shortfall. And so there are super fun sites in Yellowstone that they've been waiting more than 20 years to fix that are going to certainly be more of a priority than wildlife crossings. Unfortunately, the National Park Service is pretty broke, and not a lot of funding goes towards them these days. And so that would be the first step, is wildlife crossings are a pretty big financial undertaking. So great question there. Mark, good question. What wolf or bear sanctuaries exist in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem for visitors to see? Mark, there is one AZA accredited facility that I definitely recommend you visit. It's called the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center. It's located in West Yellowstone, and they take wild bears and wolves from situations where they have to come into captivity. So let me give you some examples. A cub's mother was shot and it would not survive in the wild, would be a good candidate for going to the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center. A very young juvenile bear has repeatedly gotten into trouble with humans getting into food and breaking into cars. That'd be a good candidate as well. The wolf population at the Grizzly and Wolf Discovery Center comes both from wolf populations, same situation, pups without parents, but also animals who've been removed from roadside zoos and unethical, captive situations and put into these big, wide open habitats and spaces. Obviously, there's nothing better than having our predators out in the wild, but when these unfortunate situations do happen, the Wolf and Grizzly Discovery Center is a nonprofit. They're a really good organization that works really hard. Unfortunately, they are full. They don't have any room for any more bears. Raising and having a bear in captivity is really expensive, and they only have so much room and space. So when we do have orphan cubs these days, almost always they end up being euthanized because there's not a lot of places left. There's not a lot of zoos right now that are looking for a grizzly bear. So definitely a real issue for sure. But I would definitely visit the Yellowstone Wolf and Discovery Center. There are some other facilities in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem, but I definitely want to go ahead and push you guys towards organizations that are American Zoos and Aquariums accredited, that are ethical, and do a really good job taking care of the wildlife in there. So the Grizzly Wolf and Discovery Center would be the one that I would focus on. So that's a great question. Let's see here. Off the wall question. What is the grizzly versus black bear population, and do they hunt black bear today? I've been to Wyoming many times and have never had the opportunity to see a bear. They are so interesting. I agree. I've based so much of my entire career on wolves and grizzlies because they're just fascinating animals to me. And like I said, there's good things and bad things about any animal. It's really important to understand that predators have impact on human operations like cattle and sheep and the like, and we don't want to forget that. But at the same time, they are fascinating wild animals to see out in the wild. So definitely, if you have an opportunity to come to the Great Yellowstone ecosystem to see a bear, I really, really recommend it. A really good guide, a wildlife guide, I don't know, like Jackson Hole Eco Tours, is kind of key for bears. They're not going to be that easy to just stumble on like, an elk or maybe a moose might be. You definitely need somebody who knows where they are because they're much less dense on the landscape. But black bears, black bears are a much more numerous animal. We've got about 2 million black bears in the United States. People are always shocked when I tell them that. So somewhere around 1,500 grizzlies, perhaps, in the continental United States between Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. That's probably an overestimation, but remember the whole way we count grizzlies is sort of controversial. So let's just go ahead and say anywhere between 1,200 and 1,700 would be a valid answer for how many grizzly bears there are. 2 million black bears. So 1,500, 2 million in the terms of difference. Black bears, the American black bear, of course, is not an endangered species. They're perfectly fine. They live in 49 out of 50 states. Obviously, the only state they don't live in being Hawaii. But we've got black bears in Florida. We've got black bears in Maine and everywhere in between. Their population certainly is viable here in the Great Yellowstone ecosystem. Probably about 500 grizzly bears in the vicinity of Grand Teton. One of the more difficult things we have about bears and counting them is they don't stay in one place. A grizzly bear can have, for instance, a male grizzly bear can have a territory of over 1,000 square miles in their lifetime. And so is that a Grand Teton bear or a Yellowstone bear? If it goes between the two, which area do you count it on, right? But Grand Teton in the general vicinity, National Forest, National Park, there's probably around 500. And they're doing great. They're doing just fine. Grizzly bears don't actively predate on black bears. There's a couple good reasons for that. Most animals don't practice any form of what we as humans would call cannibalism. There are some exceptions. The river otters we heard about earlier, certainly, but that would be really rare. And that's because it's a great way to catch whatever disease that animal had. So black bears and grizzly bears certainly catch the same diseases. And if a grizzly bear goes ahead and feeds on a black bear, really good chance it'll catch intestinal parasites, bacteria, viruses, all sorts of things between those two species, versus something like a wolf is going to be pretty immune to something that an elk carries. Because they're so distant from each other as mammals. So we don't see grizzly bears feeding upon black bears very often. It would be an exceedingly rare situation. Black bear hit by a car, roadkill, for instance, or something of the like. We certainly don't see grizzly bears eating other grizzly bears very often. But once again, it is possible. Male grizzly bears can sometimes predate grizzly bear cubs, particularly in their territory, particularly those that are not their cubs. Is always possible as well. So certainly something we do see. Polar bears eat polar bear cubs, male polar bears, all the time. So in the bear family, this can happen. One of the rarest cases where we see occasional cannibalism in the bear world. But on the whole, black bears leave grizzly bears alone because grizzly bears are definitely the dominant animal. So if there's a black bear, say, feeding on a carcass and a grizzly bear shows up, that black bear leaves. He gets out of there. He wants nothing to do with that grizzly bear. And boy, if that black bear didn't immediately leave, the grizzly bear would push him off of that aggressively. So they are definitely different animals. One fun thing to remember about black bears, despite their name, they can be almost any color. They can be blonde, they can be brown, they can be grizzled in appearance, not always black. And so there's been an argument that black bears should be changed. Their name should be changed to better reflect their scientific name, which is Ursus americanus, bear of the Americas. And they should be called the American bear versus the grizzly bear, because people see an animal that's brown and they just assume they've got a grizzly bear on their hands, when in fact it's just as likely to be a black bear, if not more likely, because they're more numerous. So great question. All right, guys, I think that's about all the time we have for today. I apologize, we did have to delay our Wildlife Wednesday this month, but we should be back on the first Wednesday of February at 5:30 Mountain Time. I hope you all will enjoy us. In the meantime, if I didn't see your questions, I'll definitely go ahead and get to them in the comment section just after this broadcast. I hope you all stay safe and stay healthy and have just a wild month. So long.